than by the passion of Christ, because nothing is impossible with God. If the problem of sin is solved by God's giving of grace, then it's hard to see how to avoid the conclusion that Christ's passion and death are irrelevant to the remedy for the problem of human sin. On the face of it, it seems obviously possible for God to give grace, healing the human proneness to sin, just by willing to do so. At any rate, the only reason easy to see for supposing that it's not possible for God to do so has to do with the sort of reflections about God's justice raised by Anselm and others. And this is a reason Aquinas rejects, as the quotation I read earlier shows. So it seems as if on the Thomistic theory, Christ's passion and death are gratuitous. And of course, it gets worse. If they're gratuitous, then it's unjust on God's part to require that Christ suffer and die, since it's unjust to require an innocent person to suffer for a good that could be gotten just as well without the suffering. Worse yet, on Aquinas' sort of interpretation, Christ's passion and death seem not only gratuitous, but in fact inefficacious. Not only could the good in question be apparently gotten without Christ's passion and death, but it seems that Christ's passion and death have no intrinsic role at all in the production of this good. To see this implication, let it be the case, for the sake of argument, that God cannot or will not give grace to human beings without Christ's passion and death. Still, what is there about Christ's passion and death themselves that are connected to this grace? If Christ's passion and death are to be efficacious as the remedy for human sin, then it seems that there ought to be something about the passion and death of Christ that are themselves somehow intrinsically suited to be the means for grace. But it's difficult to see what connection there could be between Christ's suffering and dying on one hand, and God's giving the grace that heals the human will on the other hand, unless, of course, we accept an Anselmian sort of interpretation. And this is what the Thomistic sort of interpretation means to reject. It's not the case, as the preceding quotation showed, it's not the case for Thomistic interpretations that God's unable to give grace to human beings without the passion and death of Christ. So each of these two main kinds of theory, the Anselmian and the Thomistic, suffers from problems stemming from the particular character of the interpretations falling into that kind. In addition, however, both of these kinds share a vulnerability to two further difficulties. Here's the first one. There is reason to expect that there would be some connection between the good brought about by the passion and death of Christ on the one hand, and the good involved in God's reason for allowing the particular suffering of any particular human being, however that reason is explained. Whatever the reason God has for allowing the suffering of that person at that time in that way, it seems that her suffering somehow needs to conduce to her ultimate good. But salvation from sin for the sake of union with God does seem to be the ultimate good for all post-fall human beings, on the assumption common to both kinds of interpretation of the doctrine of the Atonement. And so it seems that there should be some intrinsic connection between successful interpretations of the doctrine of the Atonement and successful attempts at theodicy or defense, at explaining why particular people suffer what they suffer. The benefit provided for a particular sufferer by means of her suffering ought to have some connection to the good brought about by Christ's passion and death. On the Anselmian kind of interpretation, however, the good that comes to human beings from Christ's passion and death has to do simply with God's ability to save human beings while preserving his justice. And for this good, Christ's passion and death are sufficient. This good is available for human beings whether they suffer or not. Since this is so, it is hard to see what connection there could be between this good and the good that comes to a particular person from her suffering. The ultimate good for her, as for all human beings, is provided completely and solely by the passion and death of Christ and its effects on God. I'm not trying to say here that the Anselmian sort of interpretation makes theodicy harder. That's not the point. If Plantinga is right, a theodicy can be constructed out of considerations based on the value of the atonement alone, since the value of the atonement is so great that it outweighs any disvalue of sin and suffering. My point is different. My point is only that on Anselmian sorts of interpretation of the doctrine of the atonement, it's hard to see a natural or intrinsic connection between the good brought about by Christ's atonement and any goods putatively justifying God and allowing the particular suffering of any particular human being other than Christ. The same sort of difficulty afflicts interpretations of the Thomistic kind. On a Thomistic sort of interpretation, Christ's passion and death are meant to be somehow connected to the grace that God gives to human beings to remedy the defect of will in them. But if Christ's passion and death, or God's love and goodness in the giving of grace, or both, are sufficient to provide this grace for human beings, as the Thomistic theory claims it is, then it's not clear what connection there is between saving grace on the one hand and whatever goods might defeat the particular suffering of any particular person. For the Thomistic sort of interpretation, as for the Anselmian, the ultimate good for all human beings is completely provided by Christ's passion and death. For interpretations of both kind, then, since Christ's passion and death are sufficient to provide the greatest good for human beings, however that good is understood, and whatever the interpretation is of the means to it constituted by Christ's passion and death, it's not clear what role is left for human suffering. On each kind of theory, the specific connection between the doctrine of the atonement and theodicy, which ought to be apparent, is hard to conceive. Secondly, interpretations of both kinds were developed on the basis of reflections about the narrative of the passion and death of Christ given by each of the four Gospels. For that reason, one check on the adequacy of each kind of theory is its fit with those narratives. But consider just the powerful detail in the Gospel narratives of Christ's cry of dereliction from the cross. My God, why have you forsaken me? Although this is a quotation from Psalm 22, Christian tradition has generally taken Christ uttering it to indicate his own experience of being forsaken by God. It is hard to see, however, that either the Anselmian or Thomistic kind of interpretation has the resources to explain Christ having such an experience. Interpretations of the Thomistic kind are the most disadvantaged here. If the point of Christ's passion and death is a loving God's providing grace that remedies the defect in human beings, then what about this process would drive any kind of wedge between Christ and God? In fact, it's part of Aquinas' own interpretation of the passion and death of Christ that even while Christ suffers in his human nature, he's also completely united to God in his human nature. Interpretations of the Anselmian kind might be thought more promising in this connection, since they present the passion and death of Christ primarily as a propitiation of a perfectly just God offended at human sin. Calvin goes so far as to suppose that in the process of dying, as part of Christ taking on the punishment merited by sinful human beings, Christ experiences the torments of hell and feels them as appropriately imposed on him. But even interpretations of this kind seem hard-pressed to explain the cry of dereliction, interpreted as an expression of an experience of abandonment by God. That's because interpretations of this Anselmian kind emphasize both God's justice and Christ's innocence. An innocent man might suffer physical pain for the sake of the guilty, even terrible physical punishment of the sort some people assume there is in hell. But how could an innocent man be abandoned by a just God? What justice would there be in a just God separating himself from a human person who is himself perfectly just? And what would the separation consist in? Separation from God is not a matter of physical distance, it's a matter of opposition in wills.